The thing about multi-species research outposts, the narrator feels compelled to note, is that they operate on the principle of universal accommodation, which is to say, everyone gets what they need, nothing is particularly good, and the entire arrangement functions through aggressive mediocrity. Kepler 442f Research Station 3 exemplified this philosophy beautifully. 6 researchers from 4 different species, one moderately interesting planet with breathable atmosphere and temperamental weather patterns, and monthly supply drops containing the galaxy's least inspiring nutritional achievement, universal nutrition blocks. These blocks, compressed rectangles of beige uniformity, represented decades of xenobiological research and chemical engineering. They contained appropriate caloric density for carbon-based metabolisms, mineral content for silicon-based life forms, amino acid chains for protein synthesizers, and enough structural integrity to survive atmospheric entry without climate-controlled cargo holds. They were, in the most technical sense, food. They were also, in every aesthetic and experiential sense, depressing. Marin Ostergaard had consumed approximately 467 nutrition blocks since her arrival at Station 3, 8 months prior. She had not enjoyed a single one. But enjoyment, she'd learned early in her xenological career, was not a consideration when humanity comprised perhaps 3% of the colonial workforce. You ate what everyone could eat, you lived in environments everyone could tolerate, and you certainly didn't complain that your dinner tasted like compressed cardboard with a mineral aftertaste. The Velic didn't complain. The Quen definitely didn't complain. The Thornback just filtered whatever you gave it through specialized gills and converted the result into energy. So when the monthly supply drop arrived 48 hours late, following 3 days of atmospheric electrical storms that had damaged the station's communication array and generally made everyone's life more complicated than necessary, Marin expected the usual 200 blocks stacked in insulated containers, ready for storage and systematic consumption. What arrived instead was catastrophe in beige packaging. The cargo pod's emergency beacon indicated structural compromise during entry. The automated systems had compensated admirably, preventing total destruction, but compensation only stretched so far. When Marin and Chixith, the senior Velic researcher, opened the containers in the storage bay, they found nutrition blocks transformed from uniform rectangles into irregular fragments. Dust from Kepler 442f's silicon-rich surface layer coated everything. The blocks themselves had suffered exposure to the planet's atmosphere during the pod's thermal protection failure, and something in that exposure had altered their chemical composition. They smelled wrong. They looked wrong. And when Chixith's antenna performed the standard edibility analysis, they drooped in what Marin had learned to recognize as profound dismay. Contaminated, Chixith said, the translator rendering the Velic's chittering into flat standard. The thermal exposure combined with atmospheric particulates has altered the molecular structure. Our digestive enzymes cannot process this configuration. The compound chains are too rigid now. The station's other Velic, a younger researcher named Civil, scuttled over to confirm the analysis. 2 sets of antennae drooping. Not a good sign. Quen didn't have antennae, but their crystalline surfaces could dim expressively, and both granite speaks slowly, and frost catches light were currently demonstrating maximum dimness as they analyzed the mineral content of the damaged blocks. Silicon-based life forms absorbed nutrition differently than carbon-based biology, but they still required specific elemental ratios. The contamination had skewed everything. Corrupted proportions, Granite Speaks slowly announced, each word emerging with characteristic Quen deliberation. The silicon particulates have bonded inappropriately with the prepared mineral matrices. We cannot safely absorb this configuration without risk of structural instability. which left ebb becomes flow, the thornback, examining the blocks with specialized sensory organs that resembled nothing so much as fleshy whiskers. The amphibious researcher extended one webbed hand, touched a fragment, and withdrew immediately. Wrong texture, ebb becomes flow bubbled through the translation unit mounted on their environmental suit. Cannot filter. Particulates too irregular. Will clog gill structures. Marin picked up one of the fragments and turned it over in her hands. It felt different, certainly. More brittle. The usually uniform beige color was now mottled with darker streaks where the atmospheric exposure had penetrated. The smell was acrid, vaguely metallic. She pressed her thumbnail against the surface and watched a small divot form. "How much backup food do we have?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. 3 days of emergency rations, Chixis said. Standard protocol maintains minimal backup supplies to reduce storage requirements. Of course, efficiency over redundancy. Why store extra food when monthly deliveries were reliable? Except when they weren't. Except when atmospheric storms damaged pods and left you with 200 kilograms of inedible nutrition blocks and a communication array that wouldn't be operational for at least another 48 hours. Next supply window is 23 days, Civil added, antenna still drooping. We cannot survive 23 days on 3 days of supplies. The narrator observes here that panic manifests differently across species. Velic antennae droop and their chittering takes on a higher pitch. Quen surfaces dim and their speech slows even further than usual, each word weighted with crystalline dread. Thornbacks retreat to their water tanks and remain submerged for extended periods. Humans, interestingly, get quiet and start touching things while thinking too hard. Marin was definitely thinking too hard. "I need to check something," she said, gathering several of the damaged fragments. "Can you catalogue the damage and start working on the communication array?" The other researchers exchanged glances, or what passed for glances among species with compound eyes, crystalline sensory nodes, and amphibious facial structures. But Marin was already leaving the storage bay, carrying her collection of fragments like they were geological samples rather than their ruined food supply. By the time Marin returned to the storage bay 3 hours later, the other researchers had convened an emergency meeting in the common area. The narrator notes with some amusement that the meeting was following standard protocol: assess resources, calculate survival timelines, discuss emergency options, and generally engage in the sort of organized anxiety that made everyone feel productive while accomplishing nothing. Chixis was explaining hibernation possibilities. The Velic could enter a reduced metabolic state for perhaps 10 days, maybe 12 if they were fortunate. That still left 11 days without food. Granite Speaks Slowly was discussing the mathematical probability of repairing the communication array early, though the calculations were not encouraging. Ebb Becomes Flow had already retreated to the water tank and was only partially listening through the translation relay. Nobody initially noticed Marin emptying half the storage bay. It was Civil who eventually investigated the sound of containers being moved and fragments being sorted. The younger Velic found the human sitting on the floor, surrounded by organized piles of damaged nutrition blocks. Marin had separated the fragments by size, by color variation, by the degree of visible contamination, and by what Civil could only describe as smell, which seemed like a particularly unreliable categorization method. "What are you doing?" Civil asked, antenna tilted in confusion. "Looking for something," Marin said, picking up a fragment and sniffing it. "Looking for edible blocks. These are all contaminated." "I know. Then what are you looking for?" Marin set down the fragment and picked up another, holding it up to the light. "Potential." This answer provided Civil with absolutely no useful information. The Velic returned to the emergency meeting and reported that the human appeared to be organizing the inedible food supply by arbitrary criteria and speaking in riddles. This was noted with concern. Stress affected different species differently. Perhaps humans became irrational when faced with starvation. Chixis decided to check on Marin personally. The senior Velic had worked with humans before and knew they sometimes approached problems from unexpected angles, though usually those angles made sense eventually. Usually, the storage bay now looked like a sorting facility. Marin had created perhaps 15 different categories of fragments, each pile neatly arranged. She was currently making notes on a data pad, cross-referencing something. "Marin," Chixis said gently, "we need to discuss survival protocols. The meeting, I need access to the geological sampling equipment." Marin interrupted. Chixis' antenna performed a confused spiral. "The mineral analysis tools, specifically the heating elements, the ones you use for thermal analysis of rock samples. Why would you need heating elements?" Marin finally looked up from her datapad. "Because I'm going to cook our food." The concept, the narrator must note, did not translate well. The Velic language had no word for cooking. Neither did Quen Standard. Thornback had a term that roughly meant pre-digestion through environmental exposure, which was used to describe what happened to certain aquatic organisms in thermal vents. But that wasn't quite the same thing. The translator eventually settled on apply controlled heat to alter molecular structure for consumption purposes, which was technically accurate but missed the essential point entirely. "The heat will further damage the blocks," Chixis said carefully. "The contamination already altered their structure. Additional thermal stress will change them," Marin agreed. "That's the idea. Change them into what? Something we can actually eat." Chixis' antenna drooped further. The human was definitely experiencing stress-induced irrationality. But humans were notoriously stubborn, and arguing with them during irrational phases often made things worse. "You may access the geological equipment," Chixis said, "but please be careful. We cannot afford injuries in addition to our food shortage." "I'm not going to hurt myself," Marin said. "I'm going to make dinner." The distinction, if there was one, eluded Chixis entirely. For the next 16 hours, Station 3 filled with smells. Not bad smells precisely, but unfamiliar ones. The Velic, who navigated partially by chemical sensing, found it profoundly disorienting. The Quen, who perceived environmental chemistry differently than carbon-based species, described it as aggressive molecular instability. The Thornback stayed in the water tank and refused to comment. Marin had commandeered the geological laboratory and converted it into what she kept calling a kitchen, though the term meant nothing to anyone else. She'd arranged the heating plates in a configuration that allowed for different temperature zones. The damaged nutrition block fragments were undergoing systematic transformation. The process, observed through the laboratory's transparent wall by increasingly concerned researchers, looked like controlled destruction. Marin would place fragments on heating surfaces, monitor temperature with geological analysis tools, and watch as the beige material darkened, changed texture, and released aromatic compounds into the laboratory's atmosphere. She made copious notes. She occasionally tasted results, which seemed extraordinarily dangerous given that everyone agreed the blocks were contaminated. Chixis attempted intervention around hour 8, citing contamination protocols and suggesting that consuming partially heated inedible material might constitute a hazard. Marin explained, with what the narrator recognizes as considerable patience, that she wasn't trying to make the blocks edible in their original form. She was making something new. The blocks are composite structures, Marin said, pointing at her analysis notes. Proteins, carbohydrates, minerals, all compressed together in standardized ratios. The contamination and thermal damage didn't destroy those components. It just broke apart the structure and altered some of the molecular bonds. Yes, Chixis agreed. Making them inedible, making them raw materials, Marin corrected. Look, the protein compounds are still intact, just denatured. The carbohydrate matrices are fractured, but still present. The minerals from the contamination are actually useful trace elements, and the thermal damage during entry. That actually started some interesting chemical reactions. Chixis' antenna tilted at a confused angle. I don't understand. I know, Marin said. Not unkindly. Your species evolved perfect digestive enzymes that can process prepared nutrition efficiently. You didn't need to develop food transformation technology. But humans, she gestured at the heating plates. We evolved around fire. We've been applying controlled heat to alter food structure for thousands of years. It's not cultural preference, it's survival technology. You're saying heat makes food edible. I'm saying heat changes food at a molecular level. It breaks down tough structures, denatures proteins in ways that make them easier to digest, neutralizes certain toxins, and creates new compounds that our bodies can actually use. The Maillard reaction alone, she caught Chixis' blank expression. Never mind. The point is, these damaged blocks, they're not ruined food, they're ingredients. The Velic researcher absorbed this information slowly. Can you make ingredients that we can digest? I'm going to try, Marin said. Give me 24 hours before we implement emergency hibernation protocols. If this doesn't work, we'll do it your way. Chixis' antenna performed a gesture that the translator rendered as reluctant agreement, though the narrator suspects it was more like resignation combined with morbid curiosity. 22 hours later, Marin emerged from the geological laboratory carrying containers. The other 5 researchers had gathered in the common area, engaged in the sort of grim silence that precedes difficult decisions. The hibernation protocols were prepared. The emergency rations had been carefully divided into minimal sustaining portions. The communication array repairs were progressing slowly. Everything was terrible in that organized protocol-following way that made it somehow worse. Then the human walked in carrying food. Or what Marin insisted was food. The containers held substances that looked nothing like nutrition blocks. One contained liquid, faintly amber, with visible particulates suspended throughout. Another held what appeared to be crystals, though they were darker and more irregular than Quen's standard mineral supplements. A third container held a paste-like substance, beige but with a texture completely unlike the original blocks. I made lunch, Marin announced. The statement hung in the air, translated into 4 languages, understood by none of them. Marin set the containers on the common area table. Okay, so full disclosure, this is experimental xenobiology. I've never prepared food for any of your species before, but I worked from your physiological databases and tried to create something that matches your nutritional requirements and digestive capabilities. She pushed the liquid container toward ebb becomes flow. For you I made a protein suspension. The liquid is purified water from our lab systems, and I dissolved the protein compounds from the blocks after heat treatment broke down the molecular chains. It should filter easily through your gill structures. The particulates are all small enough for your system, and I adjusted the mineral content to match your osmotic balance requirements. The thornback approached cautiously, extending sensory whiskers toward the container. After a long moment of chemical analysis, Ebb becomes flow submerged their feeding apparatus and began filtration. Everyone watched. The Thornback's body language shifted subtly, relaxation rather than stress. Nutrients extracting efficiently. Ebb becomes flow bubbled. Better distribution than standard blocks. Texture appropriate. This is acceptable. Acceptable, the narrator notes, was approximately the highest praise a Thornback ever gave anything. Marin moved to the crystalline container. Granite speaks slowly. Frost catches light. I separated the mineral components and used heat to restructure them. The contaminating silicon particles were actually helpful here. I created a lattice structure that should match your absorption requirements, with better elemental distribution than compressed blocks. The two Quen approached the crystals with what might have been skepticism. Had silicon-based life forms been capable of expressions humans could easily read? They placed sensory nodes against the restructured minerals. Their surfaces brightened noticeably. Molecular structure optimized. Granite speaks slowly said, each word resonating with what sounded like surprise. Absorption efficiency exceeds standard nutrition block configuration by approximately 18%. This is superior. Superior. From a Quen. That was practically an emotional outburst. Finally, Marin picked up the paste container and presented it to Chixith and Civil. For Velic digestive systems, I pre-processed the molecular chains using heat to break down the rigid structures that formed during contamination. This paste should bypass the enzyme compatibility problem. The proteins are already partially broken down, the carbohydrates are in simpler chains, and I added some of the liquid suspension to improve texture. Chixith antenna performed a complicated spiral that indicated extreme uncertainty. But hunger was a powerful motivator. The senior Velic extended a feeding appendage, sampled the paste, and froze. This is digestible, Chixith said slowly. This is easily digestible, more easily than standard blocks. Civil tried the paste as well, antennae straightening with what Marin had learned to recognize as pleased surprise. The texture is superior. The molecular chains are optimal for our enzyme systems. How did you achieve this? I cooked it, Marin said simply. She picked up her own container. The porridge she'd made for herself, which looked exactly like institutional gruel, because that's essentially what it was. My species learned a long time ago that applying heat to food isn't just about taste, though that's nice. It's about making nutrients bioavailable, breaking down tough structures, neutralizing toxins, transforming the inedible into the edible. She sat down at the table with her gruel. You all evolved to handle standard nutrition efficiently. Perfect digestive systems for processed food. But humans, we evolved to be mediocre at digestion and exceptional at making things digestible. We're not particularly good at eating what the universe provides, but we're excellent at making the universe provide something we can eat. The other researchers slowly joined her at the table, each with their prepared portion. The narrator observes that this was perhaps the first time in Station 3's operational history that all 6 researchers had actually eaten together. Nutrition block consumption usually happened individually, on personal schedules, as efficiently as possible. But this was different. This was in a way none of them fully articulated, a meal. So the damaged blocks, Frost catches light said slowly, were not a crisis you solved. They were an opportunity you recognized. The damage actually helped, Marin admitted between bites of her thoroughly mediocre porridge. The fracturing exposed different layers with different properties. The contamination added trace minerals. The thermal alteration during entry started chemical reactions I could work with. If the blocks had arrived perfect, I never would have thought to do this. But once they were broken apart into raw components, That's when they became useful. This is a human survival technology. Chixis asked. This cooking? One of them, Marin said. We've got others. Tool use, pattern recognition, persistence hunting, collaborative problem solving. But yeah, cooking is a big one. We've been doing it for maybe 2 million years. Long enough that we co-evolved with it. Our digestive systems are actually kind of terrible compared to most species. But we don't need perfect digestion when we can pre-process food externally. She finished her porridge, which tasted about as good as nutrition block gruel could ever taste, which is to say not very. But it was warm, and it was textured, and it was food that had been prepared rather than simply consumed. And that somehow made it better. I can keep doing this, she said. The damaged blocks will last us until the next supply shipment, maybe longer if we're careful. I'll need help. Monitoring temperatures, tracking nutritional ratios, optimizing preparation for each species. But we can do this. Over the following days, Station 3 settled into new routines. 3 times daily, Marin transformed damaged nutrition blocks into proper meals. The narrator uses the term advisedly because they truly were meals now, not just nutritional intake sessions. The preparation became a social activity. Chixith learned to monitor the heating plates, developing an intuitive sense for which temperatures served which purposes. Civil became expert at identifying which block fragments had which properties, sorting them into categories that made Marin's preparation more efficient. Granite speaks slowly and Frost catches light, approached the process with characteristic Quen mathematical precision, calculating optimal thermal transfer rates and developing models for mineral restructuring. They discovered that certain heating patterns produced crystal formations with superior absorption properties. The narrator notes with amusement that the Quen essentially invented metallurgy for food, approaching cooking as materials science. Even ebb becomes flow contributed, helping optimize the liquid suspensions and teaching Marin the nuances of Thornback filtration requirements. Turns out that particulate size distribution followed very specific patterns, and getting those patterns right was the difference between adequate nutrition and excellent nutrition. The meals themselves became communal events. Not intentionally, that's just what happened when preparation required coordination and timing. Someone needed to monitor the Thornback suspension, while someone else restructured Quen crystals, while someone else processed Velic paste, while Marin handled her own cooking. They worked together, and then they ate together, and somewhere in that process the meals became less about efficient nutrition intake and more about shared experience. Explain taste again, Chixith said during one meal, antenna tilted in the posture that indicated focused attention. I still don't understand the concept. It's chemical sensing related to food consumption, Marin said, not for the first time. Humans evolved to identify nutritious versus poisonous foods through taste. Sweet usually meant good calories. Bitter often meant toxins. Umami indicated proteins. We developed preferences based on survival advantage. But you can analyze food chemically. Civil pointed out. Why taste it? Because taste is immediate, Marin said. Chemical analysis takes time. If you're trying to decide whether to eat something in an environment where poisonous and nutritious foods look similar, rapid sensory feedback is valuable. Plus, once you've got the ability to sense taste, it becomes part of how you experience food. The sensory input matters. Granite speaks slowly resonated thoughtfully. Your species evolved to find food consumption pleasurable. Some of us more than others, Marin said dryly. But generally, yes. Eating things that are good for you triggers positive feedback, makes you want to eat them again. Helps with survival. Fascinating. Frost catches light said. We absorb minerals. The process is neither pleasurable nor unpleasant. It simply is necessary. Same with filtration. Ebb becomes flow added. Nutrients extract. Body uses them. No sensation beyond fullness or hunger. Our enzyme systems process food automatically, Chixith said. There is no sensory component beyond chemical identification of edibility. Marin considered this. So eating is just refueling for all of you, pure function, no experience. Yes, all 4 aliens confirmed, in their various ways. That's depressing, Marin said. Why? Civil asked. It's efficient. Efficiency isn't everything, Marin said. Sometimes the experience matters. The ritual, the sharing, She paused, looking around the table at 5 alien researchers who had absolutely no framework for understanding what she meant. Never mind. More importantly, I think I've figured out how to improve the Quen crystal formation. If we adjust the heating rate during the initial phase, the conversation shifted back to technical details, because that was comfortable ground for everyone. But the narrator notes that something had shifted in Station 3. The meals continued to be communal. The preparation remained collaborative, and though none of the non-human researchers could taste their food or experience it as anything beyond necessary nutrition, they still showed up 3 times daily to eat together. Maybe efficiency wasn't everything after all. On day 23, the supply ship arrived. The delivery crew consisted of 2 Velic and 1 Quen, piloting a standard cargo vessel with fresh nutrition blocks and communication array replacement parts. They docked expecting crisis conditions, starving researchers, emergency protocols, possibly casualties. Supply chain failures were rare but serious. 23 days without food would have killed most carbon-based species. Instead, they found Station 3 operating normally. Well, not normally. The common area smelled strange. The geological laboratory had been reconfigured in ways that made no sense. And when they entered, they found all 6 researchers engaged in what appeared to be coordinated food preparation. Marin was explaining something about thermal retention, while Chixis monitored 3 heating plates simultaneously. Civil was sorting block fragments with practiced efficiency. The 2 Quen were calculating something on a shared data display. The Thornback was testing liquid suspension density. What is happening here? The delivery crew's senior Velic asked, antenna performing confused spirals. Lunch is in 10 minutes, Marin said, not looking up from the heating plate she was monitoring. You're welcome to stay. We've got plenty. The delivery crew exchanged glances, or the alien equivalent thereof. We received reports of a catastrophic supply failure, the Quen delivery pilot said, their translated voice resonating with confusion. 23 days without nutrition. We expected emergency conditions. Oh, the supply drop was completely destroyed, Chixis confirmed cheerfully. Total contamination. All blocks inedible in standard form. Then how are you alive? Marin cooked them, Civil said, as if this explained everything. It explained nothing. Marin finally looked up from her heating plate. The blocks were damaged but not destroyed. I used thermal processing to break them down into component materials and restructured them into species-appropriate nutrition. Want to see the preparation protocols? I've been documenting everything. The delivery crew spent the next hour trying to understand what had happened. Marin provided detailed technical documentation, thermal profiles, molecular restructuring processes, nutritional analysis, species-specific optimization. She showed them the before and after damaged, inedible blocks versus prepared digestible food. She explained the principles of cooking. though the concept clearly struggled to translate. You transformed contaminated supplies into superior nutrition using heat application, the Quen pilot asked, attempting to summarize. Essentially, yes, Marin confirmed. This is a human technology.